In a high-security congressional forum in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett locks horns with Pedro Gonzalez in a brutal ideological clash over America's immigration policy. With 73 million viewers watching live and over 800 press outlets on alert, Pedro unleashes a fiery attack, blaming open borders for crime and societal decay. But Jasmine stands tall, weaponizing real human stories and leaked messages to turn the tide. What happens when a man built on rhetoric is exposed by the very facts he tried to bury? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The heat outside Houston's Civic Summit Center was sweltering, but it was nothing compared to the firestorm simmering inside. Every seat was filled. Lawmakers, reporters, ICE officials, activists, veterans, and families with tired eyes and immigration files clutched in hand. They didn't come for speeches, they came for a clash. And at the center of that storm stood two names burning on the event schedule like duelists carved into granite. Pedro Gonzalez, the conservative firebrand with a sharp tongue and a deeper scandal, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising force from Texas whose mere presence already rattled the right-wing commentariat. The moderator's voice echoed, "Today's discussion, rebuilding the immigration system, border security, or human dignity." The crowd erupted, not in unity but division. Half stood to cheer. The other half sat still, arms folded, faces clenched. The battlefield was drawn, and the woman walking into that storm wasn't just a participant. She was a target. Jasmine Crockett entered from stage left with no applause from the crowd that despised her. She didn't flinch. Her navy suit was sharp, but her stare was sharper. She didn't come to win friends. She came to hold fire in her hands, and she knew she would bleed for it. Pedro sat smugly at his podium already, arms crossed like a judge presiding over a verdict he thought was pre-written. Cameras locked in, microphones opened, and the air for a split second felt like it stopped breathing. Jasmine knew what this was. Not a debate, not a forum, a setup. She was the black woman they invited to sit beside a man who once mocked her people and leaked messages, thinking she'd crack under pressure, thinking she'd fold before the weight of conservative rage. But Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that room to play defense. She came because sometimes the only way to fight injustice is to walk straight into its house, light a match, and ask the world why it smells like gasoline. The silence that followed Jasmine's entrance wasn't peace, it was anticipation sharpened into a weapon. She had barely taken her seat when Pedro Gonzalez pushed forward, his eyes gleaming not with curiosity, but with calculation. His voice rang out, crisp and cold, as if rehearsed not for dialogue, but for domination. "This country is breaking," he began, pacing his words like a man building a gallows. "And it's not because of inflation or infrastructure. It's because we have opened the gates and invited in chaos. Open border policies have handed our safety over to cartels, smugglers, and criminals who exploit our kindness like a loophole." His words, framed as logic, were anything but. They dripped with venom wrapped in the comfort of policy language, dog whistles blaring like sirens. He didn't stop there. He turned, staring not at Jasmine but just past her, as if she were a shadow, present, but not worthy of address. "These people," he said, "are not seeking the American dream. They're bypassing it. They bring crime into our communities. They steal jobs from our citizens. They drain our resources and flood our schools and hospitals." He gestured to the crowd, his hand sweeping across veterans, retirees, small business owners, casting blame without proof, just volume. And then, with a deliberate pause, he said what he'd come to say all along. "They don't belong here. They never did. And the more we pretend otherwise, the faster this country rots from the inside out." The room didn't flinch. It applauded. Jasmine sat still, visibly still. But inside, the storm had already started. Not because she was shocked by his words. No, she had heard them before. In every coded speech, every veiled policy memo, every backhanded media clip that suggested she, too, was only conditionally American. What cut deeper was how easily the room accepted it. This wasn't a fringe podcast or anonymous comment section. This was a national stage, broadcast live, with badges and lapel pins in the front row, nodding along like truth had just been spoken. And she, black, female, unapologetic, was expected to smile through it, take her turn quietly, and respond with reason while her existence was framed as a threat. The injustice wasn't just in Pedro's words, it was in the way the room gave them standing ovation before she was even allowed to speak. But Pedro wasn't finished. The applause hadn't even died down when he pivoted. This time not to the crowd, not to a general idea, but straight to her. His voice dropped half a tone, but the poison in it doubled. And worst of all, he said, eyes locking onto Jasmine with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, we've got lawmakers like Representative Jasmine Crockett who not only enable this disaster, they celebrate it. Gas flickered in the air, but they were smothered quickly by the explosion of applause from his base. The cheer wasn't just for his words, it was a verdict. People stood to clap, some with fists in the air, others pounding the backs of chairs in front of them. The sound didn't just echo, it hit Jasmine like a blunt force wave. She was being put on trial in real time, by a man who'd smeared her in one sentence, and by a crowd that didn't need evidence, only affirmation. And worse, they were reveling in it. No one asked what she believed. No one questioned if what he said was fair. Because the real message wasn't policy, it was personal. You don't belong here either. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. But she felt the walls shift. The conference room, once a place for debate, had turned into a theater of judgment. And in this moment, the woman on stage was no longer a congresswoman, no longer a voice of reason or record. She was being reduced to a symbol of everything this crowd had been told to fear. Pedro had dragged her into the spotlight not to debate, but to dehumanize. He didn't quote her words. He didn't cite her votes. He invoked her name the way some people spit gum on pavement, casually with disgust, expecting it to be stepped on and forgotten. And the crowd roared with approval. Jasmine's mic was still off, but her pulse wasn't. Her breath deepened. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Because when a room this loud tries to erase your voice, the only answer worth giving is one the world can't ignore. The applause died, but the tension didn't. It just changed shape, like a storm going underground. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for the moderator to call her name. She rose with deliberate calm, ignoring the rustle of paper, the flicker of cameras, the undercurrent of murmurs from Pedro's side of the room. She didn't reach for notes. She didn't glance at the screen behind her. Her hands stayed open, visible. Her voice, when it came, was low, not weak but steady. You said they don't belong here, she said, not looking at Pedro, but beyond him. Then let me tell you about someone who did more for this country than you ever will from that podium. She took one small step forward. Her name is Maria. She crossed the border into Texas 14 years ago with nothing but her youngest son on her hip and her oldest daughter holding her hand. She had no visa, no English, just lungs that worked and hands that wouldn't stop. The room had gone quiet again, but this silence was different. Not the tense, tribal pause after a provocation. This was something heavier. People were listening. Maria took every job no one else wanted, cleaning bathrooms at 4 a.m., scrubbing operating rooms after midnight, working holidays no one else would touch. She kept her head down, never asked for anything except hours. And then one day, while working at a military facility in El Paso, she saw a young Marine collapse on the pavement during a heat drill. Jasmine let the weight of the moment hang for half a beat. No one else saw him. No one heard him. But she did. She dropped the mop and ran. She shaded his head with her apron, splashed water on his chest, screamed until help came. That boy lived. His name was Corporal Joshua Reed. He wrote me 6 months later, said, and I quote, "If Maria hadn't been there, I'd be dead." She exhaled, not dramatically, but like someone choosing control over fury. 3 weeks later, Maria was picked up by ICE during a routine raid. She was deported, no charges, no hearing, just gone. Her eyes swept the room, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once. And here we are in this hall of logic and order, pretending to debate who belongs. But I've got to ask, what does it mean to belong if saving an American life isn't enough? What more did Maria need to prove? The silence was no longer just respectful. It was shaken. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't defending immigration. She was putting America on trial for forgetting what dignity looked like. The story of Maria had done something the charts and microphones never could. It pierced the emotional armor of a room built on cold statistics. Jasmine didn't pause to collect herself. She didn't need to. She pivoted seamlessly, her tone shifting from personal to precise, but the weight in her words only grew. "Now let's talk numbers," she said, eyes steady as she gestured toward the screen behind her. "ICE and CBP, your agencies, not mine, report that just 12% of undocumented immigrants in this country have a criminal record." She let that sink in, her voice slowing for emphasis. "And I mean all criminal records, petty theft, traffic violations, overstayed court dates. Not murderers, not traffickers, not what you've been told to picture." She took a step closer to the edge of the platform, her heels clicking softly like the ticking of a countdown. 12%. Meanwhile, over one-third of native-born U.S. citizens, 33%, carry criminal records. That's the actual figure. But nobody's out here calling for checkpoints in the suburbs or ICE raids at PTA meetings. Her voice didn't need to rise. The facts did the heavy lifting. So when someone like Mr. Gonzalez points to these people and says they're destroying America, what he's really saying is, "I need a scapegoat to distract you from the truth." She looked out again, this time directly into the crowd. This isn't about law, it's about fear. And fear, when unchecked, always becomes cruelty. It becomes razor wire at a child's eye level. It becomes families torn apart with no hearings, no lawyers, just a number and a flight. And when policy becomes a blade, not to defend us from danger, but to slice away the inconvenient, the poor, the voiceless, then we have to stop pretending we're debating law. She stepped back, her voice soft now, but steadier than ever. Because when law becomes an excuse to erase conscience, we're not protecting a nation, we're bearing its soul. That line didn't echo. It landed and stayed. One reporter looked up from his laptop, eyebrows knitting into something more human. A woman in the third row, once nodding along with Pedro, folded her arms and stared at the floor. Phones stopped clicking. Screens dimmed. Something had shifted. And it wasn't just opinion. It was discomfort meeting the truth head-on. Because Jasmine hadn't come to play by their script, she came to burn it, line by line, until all that was left was the question they were too afraid to ask. What kind of country are we becoming if this is what we cheer for? The air inside the hall had just begun to shift, just enough for discomfort to settle into clarity, when Pedro seized the moment like a man pulling the fire alarm. His posture changed. Gone was the defensive crouch of someone facing data. Now he stood tall, the voice of a warning cloaked as prophecy. He didn't raise his tone. He lowered it, and that made it worse. "No one dares to say this out loud," he began, slow, deliberate, like someone reading sacred text. "But there is a shift happening in this country, a deliberate one." The room grew still again, but not out of respect. It was the quiet before an ideological bomb goes off. They call it immigration reform. They call it compassion, but it's something else. It's replacement. The word dropped like iron into the center of the room. He didn't define it because he didn't have to. The phrase had been circulating in whispers and manifestos, in broadcast monologues and bullet-riddled walls from El Paso to Buffalo. Replacement theory, a conspiracy once confined to message boards and hate forums, was now crawling out of the margins and into the spotlight, carried not by masked extremists, but by polished men with microphones. "Look at the numbers," Pedro continued, gesturing broadly. "Look at the culture. Look at who's in charge of shaping our media, our schools, even our courts. And ask yourself, if the American identity is changing faster than anyone voted for, isn't that by design?" Jasmine didn't move. She didn't interrupt. But she felt the chill crawl up her spine, not from what was said, but from how many in the audience nodded quietly. It wasn't the loud applause this time that disturbed her. It was the silent agreement, the kind that lives under the surface, too ashamed to speak until someone gives it permission. Pedro had just given it, with a suit, a calm tone, and plausible deniability. This wasn't a policy stance. It wasn't even just racism. It was erasure cloaked as defense. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just debating a man. She was standing between a crowd and a dangerous idea that had been waiting for someone brave enough, or cruel enough, to say it out loud. The silence that followed Pedro's invocation of replacement wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, thicker, laced with something darker. Jasmine didn't break it with volume. She shattered it with precision. Her body was still, grounded, but her presence pulsed like a drumbeat you didn't hear so much as feel in your chest. She turned slightly toward him, not out of respect, but acknowledgement, the way a surgeon might glance at a tumor before cutting it out. Her voice was even but unyielding. "Let me ask you plainly," she said, her words paced like a cross-examination. "What is it exactly that keeps you awake at night?" She let the question hang just long enough before piercing the heart of it. Is it the fear of losing what was never meant to be permanent? Or the fear that once the playing field is level, you'll have to prove your worth without a head start? She stepped forward, not physically but morally. The shift in tone was unmistakable. "You speak of culture like it's a bloodline. You speak of identity like it must be protected from people who cook different food or pray in another language. But I think we both know this isn't about border security. This is about control. And what terrifies you isn't that the country is changing. It's that the country is evolving past the point where people like you get to decide who counts and who doesn't." Her eyes locked onto his now, not with fury, but with something more dangerous, clarity. "So I'll ask you again, what are you really afraid of? Losing privilege or losing the last piece of your humanity trying to defend it?" The impact was immediate and complicated. Some in the audience stiffened, visibly recoiling like the truth had landed too close to home. Others shifted in their seats, not from anger, but from doubt. Journalists who had been typing suddenly stopped. A congressional aide at the back lowered his phone and looked up, genuinely listening now. The line in the sand Pedro had drawn began to blur. Jasmine hadn't struck him down with rage. She had peeled back the curtain and forced the room to look at the root of its discomfort. She hadn't just questioned Pedro's politics, she had questioned his soul, and in doing so, she gave the room no place to hide. The room was already split down the middle, some still clinging to Pedro's words like lifelines, others sitting in a stunned discomfort as Jasmine dismantled the scaffolding of fear with every sentence. But she wasn't finished. She didn't come to simply challenge rhetoric, she came to reveal the rot beneath the surface. She stood still for a breath, then tilted her head just slightly, her tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. "If your concern is really about immigration," she said, voice steady but growing colder, "then let's keep it honest. Let's keep it human. And above all, let's keep it clean." She turned toward the tech assistant at the side of the stage. "Roll it." The lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell across the hall like fog, thick and expectant. The massive screen behind the panel flickered once, then glowed with the unmistakable format of private messages. The sender, Pedro L. Gonzalez. The first line appeared in bold white font on black background. "Candace Owens is nothing more than a tool of Jewish power." Murmurs broke through the silence like glass cracking under heat. Another message loaded. "She sold her skin to the highest bidder." "She's not black. She's marketable." Audible gasp cut through the audience. A woman near the aisle pressed her hand to her mouth. A man in the second row whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. And still the screen changed again. They want America weak, brown, and compliant, and people like Owens are just the packaging. Jasmine stood beneath it, not triumphant, not smug. Her arms were crossed lightly, eyes scanning the crowd. These weren't from 10 years ago. These weren't jokes. These are private messages from the same man who just warned you about being replaced. She didn't have to explain what it meant. The words spoke for themselves. What Pedro had been dancing around in his speech, wrapped in statistics and strategy, was now unveiled in its raw, unvarnished ugliness. You can dress hatred in policy language. You can dip it in patriotism. But eventually it slips out in the dark, and where you think no one is watching. The room was not silent anymore. It was stunned. No one moved. No one clapped. The applause machine that had roared to life just 20 minutes ago had gone dead. Even Pedro looked different. He had straightened his back, but the color had drained from his face. His lips pressed into a line so tight they seemed carved from stone. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just stared at the screen like it might blink first. Journalists in the press row were already texting with both thumbs. A few audience members stood up, not to leave, but to look closer at the screen, as if proximity might make the words feel less real. It didn't. Jasmine stepped slightly to the side, allowing the full text to remain behind her, like a monument to unmasked truth. "What terrifies me isn't just that these words exist," she said, more softly now, almost like she was letting the weight of it settle. "It's that he thought no one would ever care, that he could say these things behind closed doors, come out here with a suit and a microphone, and tell you what America should look like." She looked back at Pedro. "You don't get to lecture this country on who belongs when you never believed in its promise to begin with." A ripple of movement returned to the crowd, but it was restless now, not reactive. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" Another, "Where did she get those?" One of the camera crews adjusted their lens and zoomed in on Pedro, who now looked like a man slowly realizing the room wasn't just turning, it had already turned. Jasmine's face stayed calm, but her next words cut with the same precision as her opening. "What's said in the dark always finds its way to the light, and when it does, we don't get to pretend it doesn't belong to us." She turned back to the audience, her eyes scanning not for applause but for accountability. "So if you're clapping for him, you're clapping for this." No one clapped. Not this time. The screen behind her remained still, but it no longer needed to change. Its content wasn't just about Pedro. It was about a disease deeper than one man, a mindset, a cowardice masquerading as pride. Jasmine had thrown the curtain back and exposed it all, and now the question lingered in the dim air, like a challenge no one could walk away from. If truth makes you uncomfortable, what does that say about the comfort you've been living in? And for the first time that night, even those who came to cheer against her were forced to sit with something far more unsettling than disagreement. The realization that the enemy they feared might not have come from outside the country, but from behind the podium they once applauded. The screen behind Jasmine still glowed with the raw, unfiltered ugliness of Pedro's private words. But the reaction in the room didn't come all at once. It cracked open in two directions, violently and quietly. The first wave hit like a reflex. From the far right section of the hall, Pedro's loyalists erupted, their voices jagged with disbelief and panic disguised as fury. "Fake news!" one man roared, pointing at the screen as if volume could erase pixels. "Deep fake!" another yelled, red-faced, practically trembling. Someone near the back screamed, "She planted it! It's all a lie!" and pounded the metal back of his folding chair like it was a war drum. The chorus of denial swelled, not because they knew the messages weren't real, but because they knew they were, and couldn't live with what that meant. Rage became a shield. Their anger wasn't toward Jasmine. It was toward the truth she dared to unwrap in front of them. But then came the silence. It rolled in slowly, spreading like cold water across a carpet. First in pockets, then whole rows. These were not Pedro's loudest cheerleaders, but they had nodded earlier. They had smiled when he spoke of replacement. They had clapped politely when he dressed exclusion as cultural preservation. Now they didn't move. They didn't speak. They didn't look at Jasmine or at Pedro. They looked inward, as if trying to locate the precise moment they had gone from concerned citizens to silent accomplices. A middle-aged woman in a navy cardigan sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but her thumbs twisted over each other like they were trying to wring out guilt. A man in a suit 3 rows up had removed his glasses, not to clean them, but because he didn't want to see anymore. And in that stillness was something Jasmine recognized immediately. Not confusion, not even fear. It was recognition. They had seen the face behind the mask, and it looked too much like the one they'd chosen to believe in. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence now was louder than their noise had been moments before. She stood in the center of it all, the noise on one side, the shame on the other. The room had tried to put her on trial. They had handed her the microphone expecting her to stumble, to fold, to falter under the weight of a man they thought untouchable. But now they sat in the rubble of a myth she had just dismantled with nothing more than his own words, and she hadn't raised her voice once. Because sometimes justice doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like the moment a room stops believing its own excuses. The air was split down the middle, half charged with fury, half sunken in shame, when the moderator, clearly rattled, finally intervened. His voice crackled through the mic, brittle and bureaucratic, a desperate attempt to steer a ship already caught in a moral maelstrom. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, clearing his throat, "let's please maintain order and return to the core agenda of today's summit. We must remain focused on—" But he didn't get the rest out. Jasmine turned her head slowly, not aggressively, but with a gravity so sharp it sliced the air around her. Her eyes met his, not to intimidate, but to remind. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried like a bell in a storm. "If the goal here is to silence the truth the moment it makes the powerful uncomfortable," she said, "then this isn't a forum, it's a stage, and we're all just pretending not to know the script." The moderator froze. His hand hovered above the mic panel, as if debating whether to cut her audio, then slowly dropped away. Jasmine stepped forward, her frame framed now not just by light, but by moral momentum. "If people are so afraid of what I'm saying that they're ready to unplug this microphone, then let's be honest about what this space is," she continued, her tone like a fuse burning towards something larger. "This isn't a place for public discourse. This is a theater of lies, a production. And I didn't come here to perform." The silence in the room was no longer confusion. It was fear dressed in suits and polished shoes. And it wasn't just the people in the chairs who noticed. The cameras, perched high above and along the aisles, were still rolling. Red tally lights beamed on every lens. The live stream feeds that had begun as routine civic coverage now lit up with incoming headlines. "Houston's summit erupts after Crockett exposes racist texts." "Congresswoman challenges stage management over live mic threat." Local reporters leaned forward, eyes wide, hands typing furiously. National outlets began picking up the story, clipping Jasmine's words mid-sentence and blasting them onto social media. Newsrooms went into overdrive. Screens flickered with banners. Phones vibrated in the audience. What had begun as a tightly scripted political forum had become something uncontrollable. Real. Jasmine didn't revel in the moment. She didn't gloat or pause for applause. She stood her ground, calm and clear, not because the room gave her permission, but because the truth already had. And in that moment, she exposed something far more dangerous than the man beside her. She exposed how power always flinches when truth refuses to wait its turn. The weight of the silence was becoming unbearable, not just for the audience, but for Pedro himself. After the racist messages, after the cold exposure of his words stripped from their digital hiding places and laid bare under the unforgiving lights, he could no longer hide behind applause or party lines. The mask had cracked. His posture was no longer confident. It was defensive, uncertain. Still, he forced himself to stand, slowly, stiffly, as if gravity had grown stronger in the last 5 minutes. He walked to the front of the stage, adjusted the mic with trembling fingers, and cleared his throat. But the sound that came out wasn't the bold, polished voice that had ignited the room earlier. It was brittle, controlled only by pride. "I've said things," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "Things I regret. Things that don't reflect who I am anymore." He scanned the room, perhaps looking for an ally, a sympathetic nod, even the comfort of someone looking away in discomfort. He found none. "But I didn't come here to be attacked. I came to talk about policy, immigration, sovereignty, law enforcement, security." The more he spoke, the more the audience could hear the fracture line forming in his tone, like someone walking through a crumbling building still trying to give a lecture on its architecture. "This wasn't supposed to be a trial," he added weakly, "and certainly not a character assassination." And that was when Jasmine moved. She didn't step forward. She didn't raise her voice. But the shift in energy was instant. She turned her head to him, eyes calm but cutting, and spoke into her mic with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. We can't talk about immigration, she said slowly, each syllable deliberate. If the person leading the conversation views immigrants as something to be sterilized, controlled, or expelled like disease, her voice didn't tremble. It resonated. You don't get to claim neutrality after calling people parasites behind closed doors. You don't get to speak about American values when your private thoughts sound like propaganda from a regime history tried to erase. The tension snapped. Gasps, murmurs, sharp exhales. Pedro's lips parted as if to respond, but he said nothing. Nothing coherent anyway. He blinked twice, took a step back from the mic, and stared at the floor as if answers might be written there. Then from the middle of the crowd came a new voice, young, unpolished, but unmistakably righteous. May I speak? The voice belonged to a law student, mid-20s, clean-cut, blazer slightly oversized, voice tight with nerves but anchored in conviction. The moderator hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Knowing this summit had already abandoned script. The student stood. I came here to learn, he began, not addressing anyone in particular. To see how our leaders talk about law, policy, solutions. But I've watched a man, Mr. Gonzalez, stand on this stage and talk about security while harboring contempt for the very people these laws affect. You say you're here to talk about immigration, sir? His eyes locked onto Pedro. Then talk about it. But first, why haven't you apologized? Not some half-measured regret for being caught, but a real apology. Why haven't you looked into the faces of the people you called garbage and said, I was wrong? You are human? I failed to see that? Pedro didn't respond. The student took one step forward as if the act of standing demanded proximity to the truth. Because that's what's missing from this entire performance. Humanity. You came here in a suit, wrapped in data and fear. But we've seen what's behind that. And if anyone should be asked to leave this room, it's not the woman exposing your words. It's the man who wrote them. A thunderous silence followed, not empty, but charged. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. The student had done what institutions rarely allow. He named the imbalance. He refused the hierarchy. And in doing so, he made the moment unmistakably clear. This wasn't just about one man's words. It was about the ecosystem that enabled them. The room, which had been split, now leaned. Not in applause, but in awareness. Pedro sat down without another word. Slowly, carefully, as though afraid the act itself might trigger judgment. His back no longer straight. His presence no longer central. Jasmine turned back to the mic, not to gloat, not to continue the assault, but to anchor the silence before it could dissolve into spectacle. This isn't about winning, she said softly. It's about remembering who we are when no one's looking. The words you speak in secret reveal the nation you think you belong to. And if that nation is built on hate, no amount of flags or policy papers can hide it. Her voice didn't break, but the room did. Not violently, quietly. People looked inward. Aides avoided each other's eyes. Phones buzzed quietly with texts that no one wanted to read aloud. The truth had been spoken, not screamed, not forced, but laid out like a mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time, many saw not just Pedro, they saw themselves. The silence that followed the law student's words didn't dissipate. It condensed, thickened. It wrapped itself around the walls of the room like humidity before a thunderclap, tightening every breath, making even the smallest movement feel intrusive. Jasmine stood still at the center, her composure unshaken but visibly burdened by the emotional weight now resting on the shoulders of everyone present. Pedro had gone quiet, not by choice, but by force, the kind of force that comes not from opposition, but from the truth pressing down like a closing door. And in that dense, suffocating pause, a voice rose, not young, not rehearsed, not political. It cracked as it emerged, but it cut deeper than anything that had come before. From the far left side of the audience, a woman, late 60s, perhaps early 70s, rose to her feet. She was dressed in a faded blue blazer, the kind worn by those who had seen their fair share of folded flags. Her hair was silver and pulled back in a tight knot, but her hands trembled slightly as she held on to the back of the chair in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The pain in her words carried more force than a megaphone ever could. My son, she began, pausing as if the phrase alone was too heavy to lift, died in Iraq 15 years ago. Heads turned. Attention snapped. She swallowed, her voice catching in her throat. He was 23, a medic. He once wrote me from the field about a man who saved his life after a convoy was hit. Her eyes filled, but she didn't blink. That man didn't have papers, he didn't have English, but he had hands, and he used them to stop my boy from bleeding out in the dust. No one breathed. She looked directly at Jasmine, her chin quivering but her spine straight. Congresswoman Crockett, today you said something I've been waiting 15 years to hear. You gave dignity back to someone who never asked for it, but deserved it anyway. Thank you. Her voice cracked at the end, and she lowered her head as if exhaling the grief she had carried silently across a decade and a half of political noise. Then came the sound no one expected in a room so politically fractured. Applause. It didn't start with thunder. It started like rain, soft, scattered, uncertain. But it spread. Hands that had been clenched all night opened. Palms met palms. Rows that had stayed still through every data point and counter-argument now leaned forward, clapping not for ideology, but for something older, deeper. The sound rose not in support of a party, or a platform, or even a person. It rose for humanity. And in that moment, the room, this artificially lit, heavily moderated, deeply polarized room, breathed together for the first time. Pedro sat frozen, watching the shift with the kind of brittle stillness that only arrogance can produce when it's faced with its expiration date. Then, almost reflexively, he leaned into his microphone and let out a low, dismissive laugh. It wasn't full-bodied, it was hollow, defensive, the sound of someone trying to reclaim control that had already slipped beyond reach. This is emotion, he said, sneering slightly. Not logic, not law, not order. It's sentiment masquerading as substance. He leaned back, as if confident the cold weight of reason would roll back over the room like a tide. Jasmine turned toward him slowly, her expression unreadable, her breath steady. She didn't snap. She didn't raise her voice. Her rebuttal came so softly that the microphones had to lean in to catch it, but the quietness made it hit harder, like a whispered truth spoken at a funeral. When the heart no longer leads the mind, she said, her tone clear, unwavering, then reason becomes nothing more than the cold echo of power, detached, sharp, and incapable of justice. The words settled into the air, not like a punch, but like a verdict, final, measured, irrefutable. The moderator said nothing. The press didn't move. Even the cameras, still blinking with red lights, seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to frame what had just happened. Pedro opened his mouth again, but closed it just as quickly, realizing there was no pivot here. No data point, no soundbite, no statistics that could drown out the resonance of a mother's grief or the simplicity of what Jasmine had just named. That logic without empathy is violence in disguise. Jasmine turned back toward the audience. She didn't ask for applause, she didn't bask in it. She merely stood, still, present. Her silence now was a posture of listening, not victory, because she knew that something had broken, and not in the destructive sense. Something had opened. For just a moment, ideology had given way to recognition, and it wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. People who had been leaning away were now leaning in, not just toward Jasmine, but toward themselves, toward the questions they had avoided for too long, about whose voices they believed, about what stories they dismissed, about what truths they traded away for the comfort of certainty. And in the middle of it all stood a woman who had been told to sit down from the moment she walked in. A woman whose mic they'd almost cut. A woman who had been called unqualified, too emotional, too radical, now holding the room with nothing but her presence and the truth it carried. Because in that moment, the real authority didn't come from titles or podiums. It came from the willingness to name what others refused to see. That human dignity is not partisan, and justice without empathy is just another kind of cruelty in a suit. The tension that gripped the room after Jasmine's words didn't dissipate. It calcified. It became something solid, weighty, impossible to ignore. Pedro sat motionless, his shoulders now slouched beneath the invisible gravity of a moment he no longer controlled. He had once owned the room with sound bites and certainty, but now he couldn't even hold eye contact. His hands, once animated with conviction, sat clenched and still in his lap. The lights on him felt hotter. The silence around him was no longer a pause. It was judgment. He looked down at his notes, blank paper now, and then stood, the motion slow and stilted. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement, no parting line. Just a man folding under the pressure of a truth he could no longer outrun. Pedro turned from the microphone and began walking toward the side of the stage. No one clapped. No one stopped him. Not a single person moved to follow. The absence of sound was louder than any protest. He had not been forced out. He had not been shouted down. He had simply been rendered irrelevant. His exit wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost ghost-like. Because when the narrative falls apart, it doesn't explode. It dissolves. Up at the front, the moderator shifted awkwardly in his chair. He leaned toward his microphone, glancing between his clipboard and the teleprompter, visibly unsure how to proceed. His job was to manage time, to keep the program orderly, to make transitions smooth. But nothing about this moment was smooth. The page in front of him meant nothing now. The rules of the forum, neutrality, control, containment, had already been obliterated by truth, and truth didn't wait for intermission. He took a breath and began to speak, already forming the phrase, "We'll take a short break." But then he heard it, the gentle tap of heels across the hardwood stage. Jasmine Crockett was already stepping forward, not rushed, not theatrical, deliberate, calm. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable. She moved to the mic and spoke before the moderator could finish his sentence. Her voice was quiet, not even fully amplified yet, but the room fell still with instinct. She didn't need volume to command attention anymore. She had already earned something more powerful, credibility. "If we stop now," she said, steady as a judge delivering a verdict, "we're saying that the only truths worth hearing are the ones that fit our schedule." She let that sit for a moment, not for dramatic pause, but for ethical weight. Her gaze swept the room. "We're saying that the uncomfortable parts of justice are optional, that we can shelve accountability when it feels heavy and resume it once we've had coffee and a bathroom break." A few people in the front row blinked. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. No one moved toward the doors. "This isn't a detour from the topic," Jasmine continued. "This is the topic. Immigration isn't just numbers. It's narratives. It's about whose humanity gets reduced to paperwork and whose cruelty gets elevated to policy. What we saw here today wasn't a distraction. It was the disease beneath the debate." The moderator leaned back in his chair. His hands, now folded, rested on the table, and he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Even the cameras had gone still, no longer panning, no longer hunting for better angles. They were simply recording, capturing, documenting a rupture in real time. "You don't have to agree with me," Jasmine said, softer now, "but you do have to sit with this, with what was said, with who said it, with who stayed silent while it was being said." Her voice didn't carry blame, it carried insistence. Because if we only debate when it's easy, then we're not having debates. We're running from them. No one left, no one stood. Even the staff at the back, who had begun preparing to reset microphones and shuffle papers, froze in place. Something had shifted, not just in tone, but in expectation. The audience had come for talking points. What they received was a confrontation with complicity. And Jasmine, alone at the microphone, didn't wield that moment with pride or victory. She carried it with a kind of moral sobriety, like a surgeon holding a scalpel she never wanted to use, but knew was necessary. "The truth doesn't wait for a better time," she said finally, "and if we're brave enough, neither should we." The words weren't poetic, they weren't rehearsed, but they landed with the resonance of something irreversible. No one applauded, not out of protest, but because the moment itself demanded silence, not as absence, but as reverence. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett did not speak for applause. She didn't speak for sound bites. She spoke to end the performance and begin the reckoning. The lights above the stage had dimmed to a muted glow, the air in the room now heavier than it had ever been, not from heat or humidity, but from the sheer mass of everything that had just happened. Words had been spoken that could not be taken back. Truths had been laid bare that could no longer be ignored. And now, with Pedro gone and the crowd still rooted to their seats, Jasmine Crockett remained where so many had expected her to falter, standing tall, alone, and utterly undiminished. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the podium, her posture still, her eyes scanning the room. Not as a politician looking for applause, but as a witness confirming that the truth had been heard. She could feel the silence pressing in around her, not empty, but filled with an energy that was electric, reverent, trembling. She took one breath, slow and measured, and then she spoke the final words of the night, not as a closing statement, but as a legacy, planted like a stake in the center of that chamber. My ancestors, she said, her voice low and unwavering, did not come to this country through airports or visa programs. There was no stir in the audience, only an almost reverent stillness. Every word now carried the full weight of lived history, not written in textbooks, but etched in bone. They did not pass through customs. They did not arrive with passports or suitcases. She paused. Her tone never rose, but its gravity multiplied with every breath. They were chained, shackled, torn from their homes, thrown into the hulls of ships and stripped of their names long before they ever touched this soil. She let that truth breathe, let it take root in the silence. And yet, she continued, her voice growing quieter, not weaker. They survived. They built. They endured. They gave more to this country than it ever gave them back. And their blood waters the soil of every courthouse, every school, every road in this nation. The silence in the room was sacred now. She inhaled again, not because she needed strength, she had it, but because the moment demanded clarity. I do not stand here today, she said, eyes sharp, voice calm, to demand a revision of the past. I do not stand here to collect a debt or to tally grievances. Her hand lifted slightly, not in gesture, but in offering. A bridge, not a blade. I stand here, she said, and now her voice was deeper, anchored, to make sure the future doesn't require the same repair, that the children of tomorrow won't have to relitigate the dignity of their families, that we don't force another generation to prove its humanity from behind microphones and surveillance cameras. And then she said it. The people who brought me here were not immigrants. They were cargo. A few audible gasps stirred the air, shocked not at the words, but at their naked truth. Jasmine's eyes never left the crowd. They were human beings turned into ledger entries, and still, they gave birth to someone who now stands before you, not in shame, but in sovereignty. The silence trembled. But I did not come here tonight to reclaim what was taken from them, she said. I came here so that no one else, ever, has to fight this fight again. And with that, her voice softened, her shoulders relaxed just slightly. She wasn't performing. She was remembering on behalf of everyone who had ever been told to sit down, to wait their turn, to stay in their place. I came here not to demand history be rewritten. I came here to ensure that the future never needs an apology. That was the moment the first person stood. It was an older man in a brown suit, his tie slightly loose, his hands wringing together in front of him. Not in applause, not in protest, just standing, quietly, because something inside him had shifted, and to remain seated would have been dishonest. Then another, then two more. And then it was like the entire room rose at once, neither in unison nor in delay, but with the reluctant, reverent coordination of people who had just witnessed something undeniable. There was no music, no cue. This wasn't theater. It was awakening. Row after row stood, not for party, not for politics, but for a moment of moral clarity that had pierced through all their biases and calculations like a flare in the dark. Jasmine didn't look surprised. She looked resolute. She nodded once, softly, but didn't bow. She hadn't come for recognition. She had come for reckoning. And the room, this fractured, ideologically exhausted, politically saturated room, had finally heard her. Then, as if on instinct, The camera panned to the back of the room, almost like it knew where the heart of the moment was truly beating. There he was, a young man, maybe late 20s, brown skin, short military cut, pressed dress shirt. On his chest, a silver and black name tag, and pinned directly beside it, Veteran, U.S. Army. His eyes were wet. He wasn't trying to hide it. His jaw trembled, not from sadness but from release. Jasmine's words had found a home inside him, not because they were beautiful, but because they were true, because they matched everything he had tried to say in silence for years, because in her voice, he had finally heard a reflection of his own, proud, bruised, still standing. One tear broke free, rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The camera held. It didn't cut. It stayed there, framing a face that told the entire story without saying a single word. A face that had served a country, had bled for a country, had been questioned by a country, and now had been seen by one woman who spoke with the weight of generations. And then, the lights dimmed, the screen darkened, and the voice came. Not hers, not the moderator's, not the narrator of a documentary or a pundit from cable news. Just a voice, calm, male, timeless, deep as memory, steady as stone. In the place they once tried to silence her, a beat, a breath, she made an entire nation listen. Fade to black. No applause, no credits, only stillness, only truth, and the beginning of something that could no longer be denied. The darkness on the screen had fallen like a curtain, final, weighty, unbroken. But silence, real silence, never ends a story. It forces reflection. And as the last image of the young veteran with tears in his eyes dissolved into black, the lesson Jasmine left behind didn't fade. It expanded. It crept into the minds of every person in that room and every viewer behind a screen. Her words, calm, blistering, unforgettable, had broken through the wall that politics builds to keep empathy out. And in that crack, something ancient returned. Not ideology, not outrage, but a kind of human truth that hits harder than policy ever could. This wasn't just about immigration. It wasn't even just about race. It was about who gets to be heard in a nation built, too often, on the voices it tried to erase. It was about who is allowed to be complex and who is forced to be silent. And Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose ancestors arrived in chains, had stood in the heart of that system and taught it how to listen. What she faced wasn't merely a hostile room or a smug opponent. It was centuries of erasure disguised as debate. Every second she stood on that stage, she carried the weight of people who had been told they were too loud, too angry, too black, too female, too ungrateful to speak with authority in a place of power. Pedro hadn't just questioned her policy, he had questioned her presence, and the audience had been trained subtly over time to accept that, to hear his sneers as rational and her truths as emotional. But she flipped that script. She didn't do it with shouting. She did it with clarity, with scars turned into sentences, with truth wrapped in restraint. And that is the lesson she left etched into the bones of that room. When the powerful fear your words, it's not because you're wrong. It's because you're finally being heard. The humanity of Jasmine's final message wasn't in its poetry. It was in its precision. I came here not to reclaim history, she said, but to make sure no one has to. That line wasn't just a closer, it was a warning. Because what she exposed wasn't just Pedro, it was a system that allows men like him to wrap fear in statistics, to build platforms on prejudice, and to call it patriotism. It was a system that lets audiences cheer for exclusion, as long as it's dressed up as national security. But in that moment, with every light on her and every eye watching, she showed that justice isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the one that still speaks when the noise dies down. It's the voice that stays in your head when the headlines move on. And most of all, it's the voice that refuses to be silenced, no matter how many times it's been told it doesn't belong. And maybe that's the real horror of injustice. It doesn't come with blood and fire. It comes in polite tones, in moderated forms, in the calm suggestion that some lives are up for negotiation and others are just assumed. Pedro didn't scream. He calculated. He smiled. He made erasure feel like common sense. And that is exactly what Jasmine shattered. Not with rage, but with a question. Are you afraid of losing privilege or of losing the last part of your humanity trying to protect it? That question didn't just confront Pedro. It confronted the audience. It confronted the country. And it asked something that no policy proposal ever does. What are we really protecting when we let fear speak louder than fact? The most powerful moment in that room wasn't when Jasmine silenced Pedro. It was when she spoke to those who had agreed with him, but didn't want to anymore, when she gave them a way back to themselves. Because the people who stood in applause weren't just Democrats or independents. Many were conservatives, veterans, business owners, people who had been told for years to fear the very communities Jasmine defended. And yet, when she spoke, they heard something deeper than disagreement. They heard conscience. That's the power of human truth. It doesn't need to convince. It just needs to be spoken long enough for people to remember they have ears. So what's the lesson here? It's not that Jasmine won. It's that she revealed what winning even looks like in a broken system. It's not about dominating your opponent. It's about restoring dignity to the conversation. It's about turning a political attack into a moral awakening. She didn't ask the room to agree with her. She asked it to feel. And when they did, when the fog of ideology finally cleared, they saw what had always been there, waiting to be noticed, that justice doesn't belong to one party, and truth isn't a brand. It's a responsibility, one that demands we look not at who's speaking, but at who has been silenced too long. The soldier who wept in the back row didn't cry because Jasmine said something dramatic. He cried because, for once, someone told the truth without asking if it was convenient. That's what makes a human moment stick. It refuses to check the political calendar. It walks in, uninvited, and demands a seat. And when it does, we are forced to ask ourselves, how long have we been playing along with the lie just to keep the room quiet? So let this moment live not as a speech, not as a story, but as a mirror. Let it remind us that empathy is not weakness and clarity is not aggression. Let it remind us that no statistic will ever carry the weight of a mother who buried a son saved by the hands of someone this country tried to deport. Let it remind us that if your truth makes the powerful flinch, it's probably because it's overdue. And finally, let it remind us that justice isn't just the rule of law. It's the courage to speak when history expects you to stay silent, and the humanity to listen when silence is finally broken. And as the echoes of Jasmine's truth continued to reverberate through that silent, shaken room, something became clear. This wasn't just a moment to remember. It was a warning, a crossroads, a demand. You could feel it in the tension that hadn't faded, but instead crystallized into something more enduring. Responsibility. The kind that doesn't wait for a better time, a better leader, or a safer seat at the table. Jasmine hadn't merely exposed a man. She had exposed a machine, a system of quiet, polite, procedural erasure wrapped in the illusion of order. And once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. Once you've heard it, you cannot return to silence, which is why now, right now, there can be no retreat. No stepping back into the comfort of neutrality. Not when injustice is still breathing behind podiums, smiling behind credentials, and whispering through policies dressed in the language of respectability. You don't get to watch Jasmine stand alone and clap from your couch. You don't get to say, that was powerful, and go back to your schedule as if nothing was demanded of you. Because what she stood for, what she refused to let die on that stage, needs more than witnesses. It needs co-conspirators. It needs people willing to lose comfort in the name of truth. People willing to push back, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them a seat at the table, even when it makes dinner conversations awkward and job prospects smaller. Because Jasmine didn't rise in that hall to become a symbol. She rose to break the silence so that you wouldn't have to be silent anymore. So this is not the time to admire her courage from a distance. It's the time to mirror it. It starts with calling out injustice in your own spaces, not just when it's blatant, but when it's subtle, when it's joked about, when it hides behind tradition or just playing devil's advocate. It starts with rejecting leaders who use fear as currency and hate as campaign fuel. It means voting like someone else's dignity depends on it, because it does. It means showing up, not just online, not just when it trends, but when it's quiet, when it's hard, when it's lonely. Because silence isn't just complicity, it's collaboration. And if you're thinking, but I'm just one person, remember? So was she. One voice, one mic, one woman whose family came here in chains. And she brought the entire room to its feet, not with anger, not with vengeance, with truth, with dignity, with the audacity to remind this nation of what it promised and what it continues to withhold. So if her voice moved you, don't let it end here. Let it be the beginning. Stand up, speak out, push forward, be louder than the system that tried to silence her, and every voice like hers. Because history doesn't change by remembering speeches. It changes when we answer them. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.